and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be talking about something really important and really relevant right now, and not to mention a little bit controversial. So we're going to be talking about book bans, censorship, racism, anti-racism, all of the above. So this topic is always important, but my mom sent me an article in mid-November about it that really brought it back to the forefront of my mind. I've done a video about this topic before, earlier in 2020, but since this is a current ongoing issue, I think it's important that we talk about it again. So let's get into it. So the article my mom sent me came from the Daily Mail, but I found most of the information had originally appeared in the Los Angeles Times, which is where I'm going to be citing most of my information, and I'll have that linked down below. The LA Times article was published on November 12th and was titled, "In Burbank Schools, a Book Banning Debate Over How to Teach Anti-Racism" by Dorani Pineda. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, so I apologize if I butchered it. So I'll have that linked down below. So in September, Burbank Unified School District told all of their middle and high school English teachers to stop teaching certain books pending the outcome of a book challenge by 4 Burbank parents. So the books that were challenged and that they're working on a resolution for include To Kill A Mockingbird by Harper Lee, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, The K by Theodore Taylor, and finally Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred D. Taylor. So most, if not all of these, should be fairly familiar to those of you who are in the U.S. For me personally, I know The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird were on my required reading list in middle school, and those books have certainly been challenged before in a variety of different contexts. But I think it's worth noting that in 2020, the racial overtones have a significance that may not have been evident before. And at the very minimum, they're being subject to more scrutiny than they have been in the past. I think it's worth noting, too, that while the reason for the ban is rooted in concerns about the impact of these particular works on young students, and in particular language that's used in these works, the first book widely recognized as being banned nationwide in the U.S. was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And that book was banned because it was promoting abolitionist or anti-slavery sentiments. So it's really interesting because if you look back at the history of banned books, often they are books that are challenging the status quo at the time. So certainly we wouldn't say that a book challenging slavery is a problem today, but we can see various different books have been challenged at various points. So The Kite Runner was challenged for supposedly promoting Islam at one point. There have been books that have been banned for reasons which have really nothing at all to do with their subject matter. For example, The Diary of Anne Frank was banned for, I believe it was inappropriate nudity or sexual content, something along those lines, which certainly is not the subject of that book and certainly doesn't have any bearing on whether or not the subject matter is significant or it's a book that's worth reading that offers a really unique perspective on a time period that can be really difficult to understand. So statistically, we know that parents are the group that's most likely to challenge a book. So it kind of makes sense. Parents would be concerned about their child being exposed to certain things, and we see these fights taking place year after year in school districts, in school boards, in libraries all across the country. And the American Library Association states that librarians and governing bodies should maintain that parents, and only parents, have the right and the responsibility to restrict the access of their children and only their children to library resources. So while that pertains specifically to libraries, there are other concerns and nuances that obviously will arise when you're developing curricula, you're teaching large groups of students about a book, versus just having the book available on a library shelf. But there are concerns when a small group of people, in this case 4 parents, can begin to make demands upon what can and cannot be read by all children, not just their own children. These books obviously have a good deal of challenging and concerning content. In this particular case, they were challenged over language used, and I think those of you who've read any or several of these books will remember the frequent and painful use of racial slurs in these books. And certainly problems are arising, as those cited in the article, where students are learning slurs from these books and using them against other students. That's not a problem that we can discount. However, certainly a book is not the only place where someone might hear a word like that, right? So a student might say that they read about, a certain word being used in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, for example, but they may also have heard it from a rap song or another source that wouldn't necessarily be as easy to blame, per se, because it wouldn't be something that necessarily the student would own up to having been exposed to. But if someone can say, hey, yeah, I learned that in a book, that may or may not be accurate, but certainly it would seem to be cause for concern. I think, however, that the problem comes down more to how the literature is being taught. And in the article, it specifically stated that a student used a racial slur against another student after supposedly learning it in Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which is a book written by a black woman. And according to the LA Times article, we know that books written by or featuring people of color are disproportionately likely to be banned. So, while not necessarily the most appropriate representation, if we look at Huckleberry Finn, which I have read, there's a relationship between a white person and a person of color, right? We also see that kind of playing out in To Kill a Mockingbird. And while I have not read the other books on the list, it's certainly interesting to me that a book written by a black woman is on the list of these 5 books that's being challenged by these 4 parents. The books in question were specifically flagged for using offensive language, specifically typically racial slurs. They were not banned for taking stances that are overtly racist. It's apparent in the article that many people view these books as being anti-racist in their own way, in their own times. That may not necessarily be everyone's perspective, but they certainly can be viewed that way in certain contexts. So it's worth noting that it's not the subject matter, again, of these books that's the problem. It's certain language that's being used in them. Parents also expressed concerns that the experiences of people of color are being told from a white lens, something which we certainly see throughout history, that the primary voices that we're hearing in literature are white men. And that is certainly a valid concern. We need to look and make sure that the diverse voices are being included, but I don't understand then why Mildred D. Taylor's Newbery Award-winning book was included on this list. So we have to ask ourselves, are we blanket banning or challenging books that contain offensive content, or are we carefully considering the nuances of each book, the context of that book, and what that book does or does not bring to the table, right? So a book written by a black woman about her understanding of a specific time period is a very different thing than, for instance, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. So it's really important to consider that while the same word might have been used in both books, the context and the meaning of that word in each book is very, very different. So many questions arise when we start, digging into this a little bit deeper. Should these books be included on a reading list for students? Why were they included in the first place? How should they be taught? And is there a way to teach these works that does not diminish their significance, but also avoids encouraging students to take the book characters as an example and start using offensive language against other students? For example, in the case of Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, would it be more or less harmful to pretend that these words were not commonly used against people of color during the Jim Crow era? Can we teach about these periods accurately without acknowledging the harmful words that were used? These are not easy questions to answer, but I certainly don't think that saying no students between the 6th and 12th grades should be taught these works is the answer. Not least because there's a vast difference between the understanding that a 17 or 18-year-old can have of these works versus an 11-year-old. But to be completely honest, while the fact that these books might be removed was concerning, I was far more disturbed when the article mentioned that Burbank Unified School District has not updated their reading list in 30 years. How is that even possible? No new books that are worthwhile for students to read have been written in the last 30 years. Nothing that could shed light on the current and real racial tensions in this nation have been written in the past 30 years or have been reconsidered from an older work in the last 30 years. In 1990, I hadn't been born yet, and while these older works can provide background without more modern perspectives, students may be left thinking, as I was, that racism was a systemic problem that ended in the 1960s. By failing to include the perspectives of 21st century people of color, we may fail to provide all students with an accurate portrayal of the world into which they are growing. So many new and wonderful books from people of incredibly diverse backgrounds have been published. These books exist now. It is up to us to take advantage of them and to make sure that students of all ages have the benefit of learning from people who don't look like them. This is not an issue which only affects people of color. We all live in this world, and we would all be better for it if we took the time to listen to someone different from us and hear their stories. Silencing the voices of the past is not the answer. We have much more to gain by making room for the voices of today. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Please let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts are on this issue. If there are any books that you found really eye-opening for giving you a different perspective, or that you think are just really helpful for people to read about this issue in general. Thank you, and have a good one. Bye, guys.